Is there a measurable way to track progress in the gym if we can assume that if you are adapting, if you're getting enough stimulation in the gym, recovering, then you should be getting stronger. You should have that positive adaptation.
In terms of tracking progress in general for like the gym, whatever that adaptation is what you should be measuring. If you care about getting stronger, you're going to have to test your strength via like a 3RM or a 1RM in a particular exercise. If you care about muscle growth, that's a much harder thing to track. But if the thing we care about is how we look in the mirror, then the thing that we should track is how we look in the mirror. And the best way to do that is through progress photos.
Today, I'm going to be joined by Max Coleman, Coleman et al. On IG. He's an exercise science researcher, published author, and adjunct lecturer at Lehman College. And he completed his master's degree under hypertrophy researcher Dr. Brad Schoenfeld, who I talk about a lot. His work examines how resistance training variables like volume, effort, and progressive overload, proximity to failure affect muscle growth. So the theme today, what you guys want to hear about, is what actually builds muscle. We're going to talk about effort, progression, and volume. And, people hear all the time that they've got to train hard, they've got to progressively overload and do enough volume to build muscle. But these terms are often misunderstood, and we see that in the comment sections, right? So, Max, at the highest level, I want you to weigh in as an expert what actually matters most for building muscle.
Yeah, so I think that was a great intro for your first try too on the first go. Well done. I think there are three, like taking a myopic view, there are three things that ultimately matter for muscle growth specifically. And you basically hit all of them on the head in that intro, which is make sure you're training hard, make sure you're training enough, and make sure you're using the right exercises when you're doing the first two. So when I say train hard, you're absolutely right. You don't need to go balls to the wall to failure every single time you train, but it should feel challenging, right? I think anytime I say that you should leave anywhere from 0 to 2 reps in the tank, people kind of view that as me saying that you can get away with easy training. But if you view 2 reps in the tank as easy training, you are either some sort of sadomasochist or you're not actually training with 2 reps left in the tank. Make sure you're doing enough is just the volume question. And we just define volume as the number of sets that you do per week, right? And anywhere as little as like 4 sets can cause growth all the way up to, I don't know, 52 sets a week can cause growth. We have research looking at 52 sets a week for the quads, which is pretty insane. I don't necessarily recommend that for anyone, but as long as you're between 4 and 52, you're probably in a good spot. And then exercise selection, that's kind of a whole other topic that we can unpack. If you want to go there, we can, but I'll wait for you to direct me there.
Okay, I like that. I'm definitely gonna jump into that towards the end. So I'd like to dive first into this idea of failure, training to failure versus 2 reps in reserve. I know you did a recent or fairly recent study, right? Comparing single set training to failure versus stopping at 2 reps in reserve. And I'd love for the audience to understand more what that study shows us in practical terms.
Yeah, so that study by itself doesn't show us a whole lot, but in conjunction with other research on volume and proximity to failure, it actually highlights a lot. So, generally speaking, if you're doing enough volume, say somewhere between 10 and 20 sets per muscle group per week, you do not need to go to failure to maximize growth. We have pretty decent research suggesting that as long as you're getting close, right, 2 reps in the tank, you're golden. And going to failure is not going to give you any added benefit. However, that study that you were just referring to by Tom Herman, I believe he led that one. I was just lucky enough to help with it. We were looking at if low volume programs, so we called it single set, but in reality, it was somewhere between like 4 and 6 sets a week per muscle. If going to failure mattered more when using lower volumes, and it turns out it kind of did. So if you're going to be training with lower volumes, like say around 4 to 6 sets per week per muscle, you probably should be pushing a little bit closer to failure. It's also worth noting that in that study, although the people going to failure did grow more muscle, it's not like the people stopping shy of failure didn't grow muscle, right? There were differences between them, but the differences were small. They were significant, so that it's worth noting. But I just want people to keep that in mind that when I'm talking about things, usually we're talking about optimizing results, but that's not necessarily the same thing as just getting good results in the gym, if that makes sense.
Perfect. So both groups grew, but failure became more useful when volume was really low. right?
Absolutely. Couldn't have said it better myself.
I'm listening. So, what about muscle groups? Was there a difference between, say, biceps training to failure with a muscle group like the bicep or the deltoid versus the quadriceps, or with a kind of exercise, right? So, an isolation exercise like a leg extension versus a compound lift like a squat. Did you get to unpack that at all? Or do you have any speculations about that?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a great question. And generally I would just say like a blanket no, right? So like it doesn't really matter if you're using isolations versus compounds, like volume is volume and your muscle doesn't really know the difference between a leg extension versus a squat, right? Your quadricep doesn't know that you're doing a leg extension versus a squat or anything like that. There may be something about like doing high enough volumes with pretty taxing exercises like squats and deadlifts, but again, that 52 set study that I just referenced, they were doing a lot of compound lifts and still growing muscle with 52 sets a week. So I think that whether or not the exercise specifics, if volume is equated, don't really matter, if that makes sense. Like I don't think that you need to be doing more volume because you're only using isolations or vice versa. I don't know if that answers your question directly, but I'm happy to elaborate further.
Great. Yeah, actually what I was hoping to tease out was if training to failure in a low volume environment mattered more for particular exercise variations for particular muscle groups.
Yes, sorry, that was yeah, it was a great question. So, most of the research we have on volume, right, is looking at the biceps, triceps, and quadriceps, and calves as well. And within those muscles, there doesn't seem to be a difference between like more or less volume needed for any one of those muscles in particular, right? You could speculate that like maybe the calves need more because they're so used to getting work, because they're so active just all the time when we're walking around and even just standing still, but that doesn't really bear out. Like as far as the volume for particular muscles goes, like in general, there doesn't seem to be a reason to treat any of your muscles differently from one another. So, like, I think a lot of people have these misconceptions about the abs, for example, right? Where the abs respond better to higher reps and higher volumes and higher frequencies. There's just no reason to believe that. I mean, there's some like good, like you can kind of like logic your way to believing that, but the evidence as far as muscle groups responding differently to different volumes and different failure protocols, like it's just not there. Your bicep is not that much different from your calf, and your calf isn't that much different from insert any other muscle.
Okay, perfect. So we can let that sleeping dog lie. I remember hearing a podcast. I think it was with Mike Israetel. I can't remember if it was with if it was a discussion with Brad Schoenfeld or not, but they were talking about whether muscle fiber types and certain muscle groups have a higher propensity of certain muscle fiber types, and if they would do better with certain training, like training volumes. So, so let's go into a practical question because as a coach, I see this one a lot, and I think you kind of intimated it at the start. What does training hard mean, right? So how can somebody get better honestly, right? How can somebody get better at accurately estimating those 2 reps in reserve? How could a beginner lifter start to understand what hard training actually is?
I think there's a couple of different ways. The easiest and most straightforward one is get a coach, get like someone that's actually going to walk you through those things. But that's an expensive suggestion for many people, obviously. Setting the anchor is probably your best way for gauging how close to failure you're getting. And basically, what that means is that every once in a while, take a set to true failure, like to the point where even if you're trying your absolute hardest, that bar or that dumbbell or the machine is not budging because you just can't move it anymore. That gives you a really, really good idea of what failure feels like. And as a result, it gives you a good example of what 2 reps left in the tank feels like. Because let's say you failed at 10, you know exactly how you felt at 8, and you can just start chasing that feeling. And every couple of weeks to months, depending on your proclivity for such, for like enjoying pain essentially, take a set for a particular exercise or a particular muscle group to failure, just to kind of recalibrate and make sure you're like being honest with yourself about what 2 reps left in the tank actually feels like.
I did an experiment like that with my clients. They've been with me for quite a while, actually several years, and we were post-show going into a build, and I said, "We're going to failure." Obviously, not with squats and deadlifts, but with machine work, and I said, "You gotta videotape it. I wanna see actual, like, mechanical failure. Like, you cannot push that sled back up, or you cannot extend your knee on a leg extension." And then from there, exactly as you said, we reverse engineered what that, 2 reps in reserve actually meant. So the takeaway, if I get this right, is that not everyone needs to train to failure, but the sets need to be generally hard.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, yeah. I mean, if you want to get better at anything, like, it's gonna probably be pretty hard, right? When you especially if you're not just starting out, and this goes way beyond muscle growth, right? Like, if you wanna get better at the piano, which I have no knowledge of whatsoever, like, eventually, to continue progressing and getting better at playing the piano, the training or the whatever it takes to get better is going to get more and more challenging as you go. So, yes, it needs to be hard. As much as that sucks, I wish it weren't the case, but yeah, training needs to be hard if you wanna continue growing.
Okay, so number 2, progression. I recently saw a controversial for me, a controversial, post where you said progressive overload does not mean adding, more weight or more reps every time you enter the gym. So what the hell do you mean by that?
Yeah, I think progressive overload is fascinating because it is one of the most foundational aspects of fitness, and again, any skill. Like, remember, like, you still need to use progressive overload if you want to get better at the piano or whatever. And yet, despite it being so foundational, it is also probably the most misunderstood thing in all of fitness. Because all progressive overload is exposing a particular system that you want to improve, like your muscles, your muscular system, exposing that system to something it hasn't adapted to yet. So, for example, if I go and I used this exact same example in the video that you've seen already, but maybe your listeners haven't. If I go to the gym and bench 135 for 10 reps in week 1 of my new program, and it's really hard, and next week I go back to the gym. Let's say it's Monday again, and I do the exact same thing. I bench 135 for 10 reps. As long as it's still challenging, as long as I'm still getting close to 2 reps left in the tank, or at least I'm getting close to failure, that's still going to stimulate my muscles in a way that, like, causes some sort of adaptation. Even though it's the same as what I did the week before, it's still really challenging, and it's still something that I need to do over and over and over again until I'm actually able to progress, right? So I think people often look at progressive overload backwards, in that we get stronger because we're adding weight to the bar, when in reality, what we're actually doing is adding weight to the bar because we got stronger. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I
Because
love that,
ultimately, all
yeah.
we're trying to do is continue challenging ourselves. And eventually, 135 for 10 is going to be too easy for me. And I'm going to have to add weight to the bar if I want to continue growing past that, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. I think it goes back to that original, point of understanding what hard training is. I think a lot of people, I saw it on one of your posts where you differentiated between what might feel uncomfortable versus what hard training is, right? And there's often a difference, especially with people that are newer to hard training. That discomfort, maybe it's the feeling of lactate buildup in the muscle group, or just that feeling of your elevated heart rate. It feels uncomfortable. Maybe you start to sweat a little bit, and then you stop. You're like, okay, that's it. And oftentimes when I'm analyzing videos, I'll see gals doing the leg press. I was talking with my husband yesterday. I said, "Oh my god, this client, Wendy, right? She was doing leg press 320 for sets of 10. She wasn't even holding onto the handles. So I know as a coach, right? She's got more in the tank if she creates more muscular tension. So there's things that we do as more advanced athletes, we might not even be aware of it anymore, but we're creating a better platform, a better base for pressing. We're somehow, positioning ourselves. I mean, not cheating, not creating a different variation, but positioning ourselves so that we can push harder. A lot of times, muscular tension and using your breath to push harder, especially if there's spine loading above, can allow you to get to those higher RAR, reps.
So I agree with what you're saying. I think that as advanced trainees, trainers, people who lift, we forget that the gym is one of the only places where we purposefully induce discomfort, right? We spend the vast majority of our lives, especially in the United States, in like air conditioned rooms where we like sleep on soft beds, we wear comfortable shoes, yada yada yada. We're like constantly in comfort, and the gym is one of the few places where we go to deliberately make ourselves uncomfortable in hopes of like causing some sort of adaptation and improving in some way. And when you first start out, your body is like constantly telling you to avoid discomfort, right? Like no one wants, like ideally, if I could go to the gym and not feel uncomfortable and still incur all the same adaptations, I would do that. And I think most people would, again, outside of some weird masochists out there. I think that there are things we can do as coaches to kind of help mitigate that discomfort for individuals. Like for instance, I think personally, and the data kind of bears this out, that when you're lifting heavier, right? If we know that a set of 5 reps causes the exact same amount of growth as a set of 20 reps, for the vast majority of people, not only is it easier to reach failure at 5 reps than it is 20 reps, but it's also way more comfortable. Like most people aren't stopping a set of 20 because they can't go any further. It's because, like you said, the like just the burn and the like metabolite accumulation, the swelling of the muscle, like it sucks. And you're fighting millions of years of evolution to tell your body like keep going, who cares, stop listening to that signal, keep going. And that's a really hard thing to do. And I think that even though some degree of discomfort is required, mitigating it as much as possible while still allowing for an adaptation is one of our primary goals as coaches. It's the same with like weight loss. Like there are ways to make weight loss easier and more comfortable, but at the end of the day, like it's going to suck, especially if you get to a certain body fat percentage. Like going any further is going to be hard no matter the number of like tips and tricks and things that you try to utilize.
Yeah, I think you had mentioned where science and where research can be challenging in the gym, or I hope I'm getting this right, is that in the research setting, you have a team of researchers surrounding the subject, yelling and encouraging or whatever, like getting that person to actually push towards those high RAR reps or towards failure. And we don't have that in the gym. I know myself when I have a client and I'll tell them like, if you can go train with somebody that's stronger than you, just spend one day, even a month, go train with somebody stronger than you. And that will nitro boost your training because the psychology of being a human and a social being, you will dig deeper and push harder and get a taste of what your body's actually capable of. And then you take that knowledge back into the gym. And so this idea of progressive overload, it's a tricky one because if you can really self-audit and self-regulate, you know your pain threshold or your discomfort threshold, and you can, psychologically or neurologically push past that, then of course, yes, right? Like, those hard sets are real and they're still getting those adaptations. But for a lot of women, right? I coach women. If I go into a gym and I look at women training, I see the guys making faces and grunting and like, observably having these slower final reps. I rarely, I saw this amazing gal do, I don't know, like 155 squats. She was probably about 135 pounds, sets of 10. She had these little like, but she, the rage right now in Mexico is wearing these BFR, like they're not really BFR. They're kind of these little bands they're wearing around their thighs. She racked it, did a hair flip, fixed her ponytail, and walked away. Right. And I'm thinking, you have so much left in the tank. And that might have felt hard to her, but those were not even close to being in that 1 to 2 reps in reserve. So could you
Yeah.
speak about that piece? Because you
Yeah.
coach people, right?
I do. So I am a personal trainer and I do have some online clients that I coach as well. And it is really challenging getting people who don't normally push to failure to push to failure. Like obviously that's like that is one of the hardest things to do as a coach is kind of getting a person to a point where they're able to do that on their own, which is really really hard for a lot of people. I also want to note that um I think probably on average guys do push harder in the gym than girls, but I also think it's exercise specific. So I've seen like if I was just looking at leg exercises, especially like glute exercises, like the average girl probably is pushing closer to failure than the average guy. But if I was comparing like bicep curls or chest press or something, the average guy is probably pushing harder than the average girl. So I think that it's interesting. I think that's just like the biggest
Very
difference between
interesting.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest difference between how men and women should train in general. Like, generally speaking, they should train the exact same, but women do have different preferences than men and vice versa, and those are gonna be the only differences that actually manifest in real variable changes between males and females. I went on a tangent there. I'm not sure if there's
Well,
anything more you want me to say specifically about, like, females pushing hard in the gym or anything like that.
no, 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 no. It's more this idea of like, is there a measurable way to track progress in the gym? If we can assume that if you are adapting, if you're doing the right, if you're in the right providing the right environment for your body, whether that's supplying yourself with the right nutritional substrates, getting enough stimulation in the gym, recovering, then you should be getting stronger. You should have that positive adaptation. If you're saying, hey, you don't, you know, progressing doesn't always mean adding weight to the bar or adding more reps, then measurably, how does somebody know that they're actually progressing? Shouldn't you be
Yeah.
getting stronger?
Yes, absolutely. So that's I want to make something very clear. When I say progressive overload doesn't mean adding weight or reps to the gym every week. The most operative and important part of that sentence is every week. So eventually, if your goal is getting stronger and or getting bigger, that 135 for 10 cannot be the only thing you do for your entire training career, right? But there's no reason to think that next week is when I need to increase it to 155 or do 135 for 11 reps, if that makes sense. So if you zoom out, that's when it really matters. It's like the same as like anything really, where week to week fluctuations in performance in the gym matter about as much as week to week fluctuations in your stock portfolio, right? You don't care about how much money you made last week. You care about how much money you make over the 30-year retirement saving plan that you have, right? And that's what you should be focusing on. And then in terms of tracking progress in general for like the gym, whatever that adaptation is what you should be measuring, right? So for instance, if you care about getting stronger, you're going to have to test your strength via whatever method you want to test your strength with, like a 3RM or a 1RM in a particular exercise. If you care about muscle growth, that's a much harder thing to track. And gym progress is a decent proxy over time for measuring if you're getting bigger, but realistically, the best way to track if you're growing muscle and you're creating a more favorable body composition is through progress photos, which is one of the more uncomfortable like conversations to have with individuals. Is that like, I know it seems crude and it seems like this weird thing for the science guy to be saying is the best variable, but if the thing we care about is how we look in the mirror, then the thing that we should track is how we look in the mirror, and the best way to do that is through progress photos and doing it. I know like Team 3D MJ has a really good a lesson or whatever, some like ebook thing you can buy that basically walks you through how to take progress photos in like the most objective way possible. But that is definitely my recommendation. Whatever skill you're trying to improve, the best way for tracking if you're improving is by actually measuring the thing you're interested in.
That is brilliant. I love that. I know I'm big on metrics too, so I say the exact same thing. If we're going into a build phase, and I do lean builds, we don't do these dirty builds, but we look at, usually for the gals, it's improving their glute and thigh measurements, and so we track that measurement. We like to keep the waist on the tighter side of things, so we don't want to see that. We don't want to gain 2 inches at the waist, so we try to keep that below a certain cap number. We try to see improvements in strength metrics. We do look at that, like for lifts that would be tied to that particular body part, and then we look at metrics, and we look at photos, and that we teach them how to do progress photos for, like, as what was it Arnie that said, "If you can't flex it, you can't trade it." So, like, don't just stand there relaxed. Why? Because muscles, unless you're, on PEDs, they're not gonna be hard and round and popping. You're gonna have to learn how to pose them, and then over time, because it's like watching paint dry, you've gotta see it, is the shape improving? Is it getting bigger? So
Yeah.
progress should happen over time, but it should not be forced at the expense of execution, and it should not be the only thing you're focusing on, especially on that week to week
Oh
snapshot.
yeah, I mean that road leads madness. Like if you think that you need to beat yourself every time you go to the gym, this is not going to be a sustainable hobby for you at all. Oh, and one quick note: I think that I think taking progress photos, both posing and not posing, is generally a good idea as well. Even though posing is especially if you're a bodybuilder, like that's what you ultimately care about. But it's also just you can pose better one day versus another, and but you can't relax better one day than another. If that makes like in terms of like a progress photo, that's just one little caveat that I'd add there.
Interesting. I like that. Um, volume. How much volume, right? So, volume, we often talk about weekly number of sets, but we've already said not all sets are necessarily equal. What's the minimum amount of weekly volume that can still build muscle, and what do you need to maintain?
Yeah, it is a great question. So the answering the first question you asked first, how much? I think the simplest answer there is however much you can handle. And that can mean a bunch of different things. So, generally speaking, I know this is for some reason contentious, even though it's not contentious amongst any scientists in this field whatsoever who like are worth their weight in salt. But the more sets you do, the more muscle you'll grow. Generally speaking, all things created equal. And so my general recommendation is that if you want a muscle, if you want, especially if you want a particular muscle group to grow, just do as many sets as you can possibly recover from and as many sets as you're still able to maintain like some close proximity to failure with. So if you go from 12 to 15 sets a week and as soon as you get above 12 you're like dog tired, your joints hurt and you're not able to push to failure anymore, yeah, keep it at 12 obviously. But if you're able to recover from more, it's probably a good idea to do more, especially if we're talking about just a few muscle groups at a time, because that's usually how volume research is conducted. The minimum you can do and get away with probably depends largely on where you're at training wise. So if you've been training for 10 years, 4 sets a week, even though that can like seemingly reliably cause growth in the research we have, that might not be the case for very advanced lifters. Like you just might need more. Maintenance, geez, man. I think the lowest we have research on is 3 sets a week. I could be wrong about that, so don't quote me. So 3 sets a week, we're pretty confident or very confident that that will maintain muscle. If I had to guess, like I would argue probably even less than that. Like maintenance in general is just so much easier for like again, muscle growth is not that much different from other skills. Michelle, you said Mexico earlier. Do you live in Mexico?
Yeah.
Do you speak Spanish?
Poquito.
A little bit. Well, your English is phenomenal. And I imagine if you
Thank
stopped
you.
speak you're
Woo!
welcome. If you stopped speaking English for a long time and you switched over to just speaking Spanish for like a full year, and you came back to speaking English, you would have almost no loss in your skill. Like it might take you like a few weeks to get back to like where you were before you stopped speaking English for a year, but it would come back very quickly. And the same is can be said about muscle. Like now if you completely stop training, you're going to lose muscle. We have really good research on that. Detraining is bad for muscle growth. But as long as you're doing, I mean, golly, I would be willing to say that like 1 to 2 sets a week, as long as you're training hard and you're using the right exercises, you're going to maintain the majority of whatever muscle that you built. And if you lose any during that period where you're maintaining, it will come back very quickly as soon as you start training it hard again with more volume. So to maintain a muscle, man, like 1 to 2 sets a week, genuinely. Three, I can say very confidently, but in all likelihood, you can probably get away with even less.
Yeah, and I think again, underlining making sure those sets are effective, right? The less volume you do, the more important it is. So it's always important to train within that 1 to 2 reps of failure, but even more, if you can have an even more important moment, it would be when the volume goes down. Um, what about length
I
of
would
time? What
even
about
just real quick,
yeah?
Michelle, I would even potentially push back on that because remember
Okay.
the study I was referencing earlier, we were talking about growth, growing muscle at lower volumes. But if you're just trying to maintain, it probably you probably don't even need to go to failure to maintain the muscle mass that you already have, even when using very low volume. So that was just a really quick correction there because I think I
Yeah,
really,
yeah.
if people take nothing else, I just want them to understand just how forgiving maintaining your muscle mass really
Maintenances.
can be. Yeah.
Is there a window of time? Can we talk about that, right? So say you're somebody who's like me, who's incredibly busy, and I used to train six days a week, right? I'd spread my body parts around to make sure I hit certain body parts a couple times, even 3 times if I had a lagging body part. And now it's like I'm lucky if I get, 3 days a week, no more than an hour, including warm-ups and cool downs. Is there a window of time that would be sort of the minimum, especially if you're somebody who's trying to maintain, we're not talking get off the couch muscle, right? But,
Right.
you know, uh, you're no longer like the average person, right? The average
Right.
civilian. You've got,
Mhm.
discernible muscularity.
There probably is, because we know things like rest times can impact muscle growth. Like if you rest for 30 seconds between your sets, you're going to grow less muscle than if you're resting at least 60 seconds to 90 seconds between sets, right? So there probably is a minimum amount of time required to spend in the gym, but it's probably much lower than people realize. And just to be quite frank, like that's never a metric that I would use to measure like how much work someone is doing. That's why I think measuring sets as your proxy for volume is much better than the amount of time someone spends in the gym. That being said, we have run studies where we specifically look at time saving strategies like supersets, like blood flow restriction, like drop sets and stuff. And you can cut your workout time in half and still cause the exact same amount of muscle growth just by using some of these intensity techniques, right? So even if you only have 30 minutes a day to train and you only have a couple of days a week to train, you can still especially if we're talking about maintenance again, you can still maintain the muscle that you already have with very quick workouts. I think that that's very well demonstrated in the literature.
I apologize. What I was referring to is there a length of time away from hypertrophy, so maintenance? Is there a length of time in maintenance where you're not having high effort sessions? Is there a length of time that we've looked at from an evidence-based perspective where now we've got diminishing returns? Like, you should go back into a hypertrophy phase, even if it's like 1 solid block or 2 solid blocks, punching in that extra volume, those harder sets, and then going back to a maintenance phase. Has that been
Right.
studied?
That's a great question. It's a great question. Um, the best study I can think of, I think, oh goodness, I'm sure I'm going to get this wrong. I think it was by Bickle et al., but I could be wrong. So I'm so sorry if that's not the author that did this. But they basically looked at if you, they looked at older and younger individuals doing some amount of volume, right? They had them on a set block period doing this amount of volume for like 6 weeks. And then, oh goodness, I think it was like 32 weeks that they looked at afterwards. So a long time, like
Long time.
months and months and months of them either training at like 9 sets a week, 6 sets a week, or 3 sets a week, or something like very low. And the younger individuals, they maintained the muscle the entire time.
I
So
remember that,
so
yeah.
I can say pretty confidently that if you're on the younger side, and when I say young, I don't mean 18, 19, I mean like not geriatric, essentially, because I think that the older individuals in that study were gonna, again, I might be misquoting, but I think they were like above 60 years old or somewhere around that age. Um, and so as long as you're like relatively young, you can maintain your muscle for a very long time with very low volumes. As we get older, muscle loss starts to happen, and we need to do some things to combat that a little bit more. Fortunately, there are drugs coming out that are going to make that even easier for a lot of people, which is great. Um, but generally, no, I'm not aware of any length of time where maintenance volumes stop working. If that, just
Gotcha.
to give the
So
shortest answer
maybe you
to
should
your
go
question.
by how you're looking, as we would say. Take your progress photos.
Yeah,
How do
I
you
think
look?
so. Of course, progress photos are going to be your best bet. I think progress, like how your gym performance will matter again, not week to week, but if over a couple of months you start noticing that like you're it's really struggling to maintain the level of performance that you had when you were training with higher volumes, that might be somewhat of an indicator that you're losing some muscle mass as well.
Gotcha. So just to tease out the difference between hypertrophy, right? So being trying to build muscle, add tissue, and maintenance, how much actual less work is needed between those 2?
Well, the
I
study
heard
that
1 to 3 for maintenance
yeah,
sets per week, yeah.
right. It depends on how much growth you want to incur, right? Because nothing in this world, especially not for us like life forms, is binary. So there's never going to be a switch where something's on or off, right? So it depends on how much muscle you want to grow. Because again, if 4 sets we think can reliably cause growth and 3 sets will maintain it, then that difference is obviously very small. But if you want to incur more growth, you need to do more sets. So that's why it's kind of hard to compare how much is necessary, what percentage of growth sets is required to maintain. The answer could be 75% or it could be like 1% depending on how many sets you're doing to grow muscle. Does that make sense at all?
I'm trying to nail you down to a binary answer, Max,
Yeah,
come on.
well, you're not going to get one. I'm so sorry. I
You're
will
a real
say in
scientist.
that
Maybe,
in that
sometimes,
study,
depends, context.
yeah, in that study, the one that I was just quoting, where they
Yeah.
were looking at, they did one, believe it was 1/9 the volume that because they were doing, I think, like as many as 27 sets a week during that first 16-week block, and then they went down. Some of them went down to as low as 3 sets a week. So that's obviously like 1/9 is still enough to maintain the muscle that you were doing, but 27 sets a week is a ton if
And
memory
that's
serves
per
correctly.
muscle group?
That was per muscle group. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's just
So a
wild.
lot like you can do I think like you're not as fragile as like a lot of influencers may think you are. Like
Oh
I
god,
know
I know.
27
Please.
sets sounds like an insane amount, but like and it is. Like I'm not going around saying 27 sets is easy, but like it's not going to kill you. Like there's no fatigue monster hiding under your bed that's going to kill you because you did too many sets in the gym or
I
anything
think
like that.
particularly for menopausal women, there's a lot of that, like the anti-cortisol, anti-stress, anti-heart, and it's just so making sweeping generalizations from uh, weak studies that are completely out of context and a lot of fear mongering going on. All right, so last question is around specialization. I saw you post about this. This is my jam, and it brought me back to years and years ago. I think in my second or third year of training, I really wanted to build a defined shoulder cap, and so Jay and I had this
You and me
program.
both.
Yeah, we had this program where we were hitting the shoulders 4 times a week, right? We were really peppering it out. We had the heavier days, and then we had some lower volume days. But it was a specialization program. So, could you talk about that? Um, you've talked about, specialization phases as a way to bring up specific body parts without, spending gobs and gobs of time in the gym. How could somebody prioritize, say, their glutes or shoulders, without doing these big long workouts?
Mhm. Well, you're still gonna need to do pretty intense long workouts. They're just gonna look very different from what workouts normally look like for most people, right? So because maintenance is so forgiving and so easy, we can reduce the amount of sets, which then in result reduces the amount of time we're spending in the gym greatly. Like if I'm doing 2 to 3 sets a week for a particular muscle, that opens up a ton of time for me to focus a bunch of recoverability and time and just like, like attentional bandwidth to a particular muscle, right? So let's say that your recovery cap for the week and in terms of like total recovery is 100 sets a week for split across different muscles, right? You could evenly split those 20 sets across 5 different muscle groups, or you could bring 4 muscle groups down to maintenance and do a ton of sets for one particular muscle. And if nothing else, it's just a practical way for people to spend their time wisely in terms of growing a particular muscle, right? If you wanted to grow everything at the same time, you're going to have to spend a lot of time in the gym, more time than the average person has, right? But if you have a particular muscle that you're interested in, you can spend a very small amount of time in the gym and still see a lot of progress in that particular muscle. And I want to make something very clear. When I talk about specialization phases, there is not research looking specifically at whether or not specialization phases, whether or not trying to grow one muscle versus 20 muscles at the same time is more or less effective, right? This is strictly pragmatic. Like we all have the same 24 hours in the day, and you're not like if you need to spend some amount of time in the gym to grow everything, and if you just allocate that to one particular muscle, it's going to save you a lot of time and energy, in my opinion. And yes, there may be some degree of recoverability also that starts to interfere as well.
Great. Yeah. So given the real constraints of time and knowing from an evidence-based standpoint that more volume equates to more growth, then the smart person is or the more strategic, maybe say the strategic person to be PC is going to y- delegate a larger proportion of sets to a particular body group, get that tissue to up level, and then focus on another body part for another sprint. Let's say like could be a 1-2 month sprint, and then bring that body part, the previous body part, down to maintenance level, which is much less volume, as you already said, right? I think that's more what we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean that was beautiful. That's exactly what I'm trying to convey.
How long should a specialization phase generally last in your opinion?
I don't think that there's any like strong answer I can give in terms of like physiological responses, right? Like I don't see any reason why you would stop growing after 6 months of just hammering your shoulders, right? But if after 6 months or 3 months or even 2 months of hammering your shoulders, like if it just gets boring, that's a really good reason to switch there, unless you're like a bodybuilder who like this your like livelihood depends on having bigger shoulders or whatever, right?
I thought you were gonna
Uh,
say that your livelihood depends on you loving boring things.
Well, if you're a bodybuilder, your livelihood does depend on you loving boring things. But like generally speaking, like there's no upper limit for like your body will
Gotcha.
stop responding or anything like that. Not at least not one that I'm aware of or that the literature is aware of. But from a pragmatic standpoint, again, like most people will just get bored of only doing lateral raises for 6 months, if that makes sense. And then you can switch over. And also, it's important to note that like you don't have to choose one muscle. Like you can choose two, three, four, you can choose as many muscles as you want, but it's always a trade-off of if I choose one muscle, I know that I'm able to hammer that one and probably get the most growth out of that particular muscle that I can. And if I switch three, like I'm still going to grow those three muscles better than I would if I was training everything, but I'm not going to grow as much as I would if I was just hammering one muscle. Again, strictly from like a pragmatic, like I only have so many hours in the day to train type of thing.
Hmm. Hmm. Brilliant. Thanks. I think wrapping it up, if you had somebody in front of you that said, listen, I've been training so hard and I haven't seen any progress, any muscle growth in the past year, what are the first three things you would audit?
Well, I think of the exact same things that I said in the beginning, which is like, let's make sure you're training hard. Let's make sure you're training enough, and let's make sure you're using the right exercises. So I would first test, like the first one is most straightforward. Is like, are you actually training hard? Because like that's the one where most people fall short. Like it's really easy to say you train hard, but training hard is a lot harder than saying you train hard, if that makes sense. And most people don't realize like how hard you actually need to train to build muscle. Then I would ask like how much volume are you doing? If you're doing like 4 to 6 sets a week for a particular muscle, like yeah, we need to bump those numbers up. I'm sorry, I hate to break it to you. And then if you're using the appropriate exercises, which again is like a whole other podcast in of itself. But let's make sure you're using proper exercises that are actually targeting the muscles you're interested in growing. Those are the
Yeah.
three things. If I ran through those and you're doing all of those right, I'm so sorry. Like you've either reached your genetic potential or you just need to pick better parents because you're working with a different deck of cards than the rest of us.
The mic drop. I think that's where having somebody actually that it's a coach, and has verifiable results is probably gonna be important too, because I don't know about you, but that ability to self-audit, gets tricky, right? Like, our memory plays tricks or understanding of what hard is or the correct execution and all that. I find myself as a coach, and I have a phenomenal clients, like, they are smart, they're whip smart. A lot of them are C-suite executives or founders, whip smart women, but I find myself repeating myself a lot, right? Like, okay, like, remember what I said 3 years ago about progressive overload or like, we don't sacrifice form, you gotta earn that load, right?
Yeah,
So
I think that people desperately want exercise and fitness and health to be this like really complex thing that's kind of easy to do, when in reality, fitness and health and nutrition, it's like very simple but very hard to do. It's like the exact opposite of what people kind of expect and want it to be, which sucks, but that's just how it is. Oh, sorry. One last thing. I promise I know we've already like doubled the amount of time we wanted this podcast to be, but the last thing I'll say is that like if someone comes to me and says like I haven't progressed in a year, before I even start asking about the three things that I just outlined, I would kind of ask how they're assessing whether or not they're making progress, because like that's a really hard thing to do, and like most people expect Instagram level results over the course of a year that happen for the genetic 1% out there, but like it's a really tough pill to swallow, but like progress is slow, and how you measure it is going to impact whether or not you're making progress, if that makes sense.
that is brilliant. That is so on the money. I often tell people, let's do a collage and compare where you were, and let's look at videos of your lifts and let's look at the numbers, et cetera. And let's look even at how many calories you're able to eat to be this size, right? So teaching them how to actually see the progress is a big part of what we do as coaches, I think.
Yeah, I completely agree. And just like the psychological wins as well. Like how does like that set you might have done 135 for 10 this week, and that's the same thing you did several months ago, but like how did it feel compared to how you did it 6 months ago? Like you did it without any hip pain and you did it an RIR of 3 versus an RIR of 1. Like that's still progress, even though on paper you wouldn't see that necessarily.
Range of motion, better lockout. Yeah, like all of
Exactly.
those things, just a better lifter in general. Max, thank you so much. People can find you at Max et al., which I think is hilarious. I love
Coleman et
that.
al.
Oh, sorry, Coleman et al. And they're also gonna get a ton of great recipes, not protein-packed recipes, right? But a ton of great. Are you a chef?
No, I'm not a chef. I love to cook. I love to bake, but I wouldn't call myself like a chef or anything like that. It's something that have loved to do since I was really young. And
And
so
and $1,000,000 question, do you eat the food that you squish?
I do. A common misconception is that I waste the food I squish, and I would say that that says a lot more about your proclivity for wasting food than mine, because you think just because it's been smushed, it can't be eaten, and I think that says a lot more about you than me.
Thank you so much, Max, for being on the show. And I'll have to have you back on talking about exercise selection because we didn't touch on that. I dragged you into talk about progressive overload. And guys, you can follow him on Instagram, Coleman et al. Lots of great information there. Thanks again.
So thank you so much.